In the last lecture, we discussed the conflict between North and South. And the conflict was basically the economic interest. North needed industrial labor, South needed labor for agriculture. And whenever economic interests conflict with each other, it is always the labor and its supporters that suffer or they get disillusioned. But at a point of time, there is always a thought to reconstruct whatever has been damaged, denied, or not delivered. So let's talk about the last lecture of this first week, Reconstruction of the South. Abraham Lincoln was really very popular with the blacks. And in 1865, when he visited Richmond, the black people crowded around him, having him as a messiah. And then on April 14, when he was watching a play at Force Theatre, a half-mad actor came and shot at his head with a very small pistol. And then next morning, without gaining re-consciousness, Lincoln died. His death really perished the South's best hope for mild peace. The awesome drama was still unfolding, and a final humbling of the South was inevitable. The Civil War had caused less intersectional hatred that might have been expected. Sections of the North and section of the South. Civilian property was often seized or destroyed by the invading armies, but they treated the southern population with forbearance. So Reconstruction ended the Confederates' secession. Reconstruction aimed at ending slavery, and they believed in free slave states. And they thought that blacks were citizens by constitutional rights, and constitutional amendments can be made. Full freedom to the slaves, right of citizenship, and constitutional equality. They were big leaps. And it was considered that the Union was indissoluble. Now instead, the Confederate states had committed suicide and should be treated like conquered provinces. The process of readmission began in 1862, and Lincoln appointed provisional governors who were occupied by this work and were trying to vacate the states which were occupied by federal troops. The plan came that the 10% vote can bring them back the admission of southern states with only 10% vote. The radicals in Congress did not like this 10% plan, and I'm sure what comes to your mind by 10%, but it is not our history. Both the North and the South, they wanted to be back into the Union. North especially, because without South, the industries would not mean much. Johnson had risen to be a governor of Tennessee, and he pardoned Southerners. Johnson was a Democrat, but Republicans believed that the Civil War was fought over moral issues of slavery. Moral issues of slavery. And if you come to think of it, what is happening to us today is that we as human beings failed in our moral life. The civil and political equality that was being sought by radical Republicans, and they thought that the slaves should be freed, they should be given a plot of land, and they should be given access to decent education. And ex-slave states were to be saved from the onslaught of vengeance. Johnson's proposal had a chance in the Congress for reasons having little to do with black rights. The 13th Amendment had the effect of increasing the representation of the southern states in Congress because it made the 3/5 compromise meaningless. So, if Congress seated the Southerners, the balance of power might swing to the Democrats. It's the same old war between the two parties. Southern voters had provoked Northern resentment by their choice of congressman. So, after much deliberations and thought process, the so-called black codes enacted by the new Southern governments to control former slaves along the North. For all these reasons, the Republicans in Congress rejected Johnsonian Reconstruction. They made a committee, and the committee held hearings that produced much evidence of the mistreatment of the blacks. The hearings strengthened the radicals who had been claiming all along that the South was perpetuating slavery under another name. Sometimes you don't change the status, you just only change the name. The Congress then passed a Civil Rights Bill. It became a Civil Rights Act. Besides declaring the blacks were citizens of the United States, they denied the power to the states to restrict their rights to testify in court, make contracts, and hold property. In other words, they put teeth in the 13th Amendment. Bill of Rights was much more expressive and forceful than the 13th Amendment. And President again refused to go through his veto. So the first time in American history that a major piece of legislation became over the veto of a president. This even marked a revolution in the history of Reconstruction. Thereafter, Congress, not President Johnson, had the upper hand. And if you think about it, the radicals were in effect demanding not merely equal rights for freedom, but extra rights. Not merely the vote, but special protection of that right against the pressure that the Southerner whites would apply to undermine it. This idea flew in the face of conventional American beliefs in equality before the law and individual self-reliance. Events were to show that the radicals were correct, that was mounted to a political revolution in a state federal relation was essential if black was to achieve real equality. And we saw it. Just the last president was a black president, an African Negro president. One historian has rightfully called these radicals as the trustees of moral trustees. The 14th Amendment came in to safeguard the rights of American, and they were called now African Americans. Citizenship, number one, equality and protection of equality, number two, under the law and of laws. Laws are nothing if they are not protected by sane thinking and sane implementation. Confederate states They contested the liberty, but law prohibited states for depriving citizens from life, liberty, and property without a fair procedure. So, for the first time, the black citizens were promised a fair deal. Equal protection clause was very, very important. And this was basically Lincoln's dream to hold the nation together. Confederacy destroyed seceded states, readmitted to the Union. So, if there is a period of American nation building, Reconstruction stands out. The Union victory in the Civil War, 4 million slaves were freed. Reconstruction to slave was the problem of readmission of 11 states. And President Johnson vowed to make the choice between the 14th Amendment and his own policy, the main issue of the 1866 congressional elections. He failed dismally to persuade voters to defeat congressmen who opposed the policy. Voters have nearly always been offended when a president attempts to influence local elections. The Republicans won better than 2/3 of the seats in both houses, and thus it ensured that they could override any presidential veto. The party also won control of all northern state governments. Johnson emerged from the campaign discredited, the radicals stronger and determined to have their way. What were these Reconstruction Acts? They were basically to rebuild the South to become a part of the Union. And they could not become a part of the Union without rebuilding South. It rested upon South, and it also restored as a unifundation, the 15th, 14th Amendments, pledge of loyalty to the government. So for the first time, the black citizens were to be loyal to the US government, not loyal to the US individual who owned them. Radical Republicans were aware that a slave would face rancor. Black might under federal constitutional law, but black rights were covered under federal constitutional law. The American persistence for this idea of slavery to be finished, it sprouted from the suffering and frustration of the warriors and the refusal of the South to accept the spirit of even the mild Reconstruction designed by Johnson. And Southern congressmen were readmitted, and they sustained their determination. All the constitutional measures that were passed in 1866 and 1868 increased the authority of Congress over the army, over the process of amending the Constitution, and over cabinet members and less appointive officers. Johnson was a poor president and out of touch with public opinion, but he had done nothing to merit ejection from office. The chief issue was the Tenure of Office Act of 1867, which prohibited the president from removing officials who had been appointed with the consent of the Senate without first obtaining Senate approval. In February 1868, Johnson violated this act by dismissing Secretary of War Edmund Stanton, who had been openly in sympathy with the radicals for some time. The 15th Amendment gave the black men the right to vote and the equality of their vote. Black slavers were basically competing politically. The impact of the 14th Amendment was against this black Republican Reconstruction was the carpetbaggers, who were the Northerns moving to the South. The real rulers of the black Republican governments were white, the scalwags, Southerners willing to cooperate with the Republicans, even to the extent of appealing for the support of black voters. And those who achieved importance in these matters sought eagerly to demonstrate the capacity of their race self-government. The legislator and administrator was a paragon of virtue. But they didn't see that the corruption must be seen in perspective. The big thieves were nearly always white. Blacks got mostly the crumbs. In big city, bosses in North embezzled sums that dwarf the most brazen Southern frauds. The New York City tweed ring probably made of more money than all the Southern thieves, black and white combined. The blacks very conveniently forgot the tendency of 19th century American democracy that was away from educational, financial, or any other restriction on the franchise. The Southern governments had a sense of citizenship facilities and amenities. And with this, the importance of education was considered to be taken very seriously. I have a little more to add to this question of Reconstruction, and I'll do that as a part 2 of this lecture.